You know what everybody misses, John?
What's that?
The good old days.
Yeah?
You remember the good old days back when video games were pure and none of them had any problems and they all controlled flawlessly and we loved everything so much? What happened, Resident Evil? What happened? You were so good before and now you're just some Michael Bay shit. But fortunately, Shinji Mikami is here to fix you with the evil within. Maybe. Welcome, everybody, back to Rage Select. We're reviewing The Evil Within today. I am Jeff.
I'm John.
So, John, have you played The Evil Within?
I have not. It's strangely enough, it's one of the games that is sitting on my table waiting to be played.
That's so sad.
Yeah, trust me,
That's so sad.
I have like 3 games that I've yet to play that is like, and that's one of them that I own. That it's like I need to get done with the game I'm currently playing so I can move on.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. A lot of people, when this was getting ready to come out, like I kept seeing trailers and dev diaries and stuff for it. Oh, it looked really good.
Yeah.
Like I looked at it and it was like, yeah, I don't know. It seems like a kind of a return to form. Once again, back to the good old days.
I will say I was a little annoyed with the marketing campaign for TV commercials where it's the people reaction shots of people playing the game.
Oh, yeah.
Which they do for every horror game that ever gets released in October every year.
Yeah.
It's like, I wish they would have gone with something a little bit more creative than that.
I'll tell you what I didn't know before we started this review was that this game had a whole other name in Japan.
Yeah.
And it is awesome. It's called Psycho Break. Are
Yeah.
you kidding me? That is freaking incredible.
Just like Resident Evil was called Biohazard.
Yeah, but that's garbage. Resident Evil's better than
All right.
Biohazard. Psycho Break, though.
Psycho Break.
That sounds like my cousin's my horror punk rock band that he has. Psycho Break this Saturday with teenage werewolves. But no, this is the new Shinji Mikami game, and I think that was the last thing they did before this. The Shadows of the Damned.
I think
Was that
so. I want to say I'm going to probably be wrong, but I want to say my memory says yes.
Yeah, and this is, like I said, kind of a return to form of, Shadows of the Damned. Kind of a return to form to survival horror. I think that what a lot of people were thinking here was that he was going to go back and essentially remake Resident Evil 4. And I think in some ways he has, but in some ways that's a really terrible thing to do to people who like video games. Anyway, The Evil Within is essentially a third-person survival horror game, and in the game, we play as Detective Sebastian Seb Castellanos. I don't. You know what I hate, John, is when the Quotey Fingers nickname of the person is just their name shortened. Like, you're Jonathan John and Quotey Fingers sitting, and it's like, no, that's just what you just shorten the name to be that. You just say, call me. Like, you don't.
Yeah.
It's not like the fish or anything. Like, nobody's going to be like, John, who's that? Oh, you mean Jonathan? Yeah. But you play as another one of these characters that to me seems an awful lot like somebody in Japan watched a bunch of cop movies and they were like, this is what cops look like. They've got trench coats on and they don't shave and shit. So you and your partner and some schlubby dude and this new rookie detective lady, there's been a call, there's been a disturbance at the mental facility, the old church mental hospital bullshit thing that they keep right in the middle of downtown Crimson City. That's the name of the place.
That's an awesome city name there. I bet there's superheroes there.
Crimson with a K.
Oh.
Mind you.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Never mind. It got extremely lame.
Yeah, it's really gross now. It's where like the B tier Batman heroes they are. But you're driving to this hospital and you come in and it's like, oh my God, there's bodies fucking everywhere. And then there's like this crazy dude, he's flickering around, and then like some shit happens and I don't know. And then suddenly everything just kind of starts going freaky, crazy, insane. And eventually it all kind of crazies down to a more minimal level, and you find yourself walking around in kind of a foresty medieval area in the middle of the night. This is where the game proper kicks in.
All right.
So this is as I said before, a third-person survival horror game, and it's got a lot of really good elements to it. But then there are a few things that I feel. Let's come back to this. But there are a few things that I feel work against it in that they are very much tropes of horror games.
Okay.
So by using them again, it's not necessarily. I don't really have nostalgia for it as much as I'm just like, oh, okay, this yet again. But let's talk about the good stuff first. First off, I feel like the game is pretty good looking, and it basically sounds it plays pretty well. It's got a very interesting kind of take on horror because it's not just walking around Resident Evil 4 style, shooting zombies in the head, right?
Yeah.
There's actually a fairly deep stealth component to it where you can one-hit kill zombies if you're hiding and they don't see you, and you can come out and you can hit them. Also, these zombies are more kind of like the Resident Evil 4 Ganados, where some of them are able to use weapons and things like that. But you start off in a forest, and you basically get a pistol. And over the course of the game, you're going to collect maybe 6 or 7 different weapons. And a lot of them are going to be very run-of-the-mill. You got a pistol, you got a shotgun, you got a sniper rifle. But eventually, you also get the Agony Crossbow.
I've heard of this.
Why it's called the Agony Crossbow, I don't know. It seems to pretty much just be a crossbow. But the Agony Crossbow is able to shoot a whole bunch of different styles of crossbow bolts that have different effects on the zombies when you hit them. Like there's some that'll freeze them, and there's some that'll electrocute them, and there's some that'll do different things to them. And what all this does is it ties together into these larger open areas that the game will set you out into, where there are multiple different ways to take on the different enemies in an area. So you can lure them into traps. Like there's traps throughout each level, and you can either lure the zombies into the traps because they'll totally walk across them, or you can disarm the traps, which will give you crafting components that you can use to make Agony Crossbow bolts. So it's really kind of a weird give and take between how do you want to do this? They give you a lot of flexibility in kind of what weapons do you want to use, how do you want to take them out, how do you want to go about clearing these areas out. And each one of the areas does have quite a bit of things to find. Like there'll be notes and money and upgrade materials and stuff like that hidden all throughout the different levels. And if you just go kind of off the beaten path and look around, you can find a lot of different stuff in the levels. Unfortunately, that comes around to one of the game's biggest fault. Okay, this is one of those things that some people are going to just be ecstatic about.
Okay.
Other people are going to be like, go die in a fire, Shinji Mikami. I'd pox on your house. There is no map, really, to speak of in the game. So what you end up doing is you end up really getting in touch with the lay of the land, because you have to kind of remember it. You can't just set a waypoint. Now, it's been a few months. I'm almost 100% positive, because I think I would have remembered if there was a map in the game. So you'll get about into a village, right? And you're in this village, and you can kind of roam through it, and pick up different things, and find these little extras and stuff like that. And you really get a good handle on what's going on. Unfortunately, it also means, because the game is very dark and the levels are very labyrinthine, and they have a lot of like cutbacks and stuff like that, you can get to a position where you end up kind of like, you're like, where the fuck am? Oh, I'm back over here. Okay, so now I need to go back over here. Blah 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 blah. So it's the sort of game that really benefits from a player who wants to methodically move through the levels slowly, eliminating everybody that's there in the most efficient way possible. Right?
Okay.
Trying not to alert the hordes to your presence, trying to lure zombies into traps, trying to make sure that once you've gone through a specific house or a specific street, whatever, everybody there is out of the way so that you can freely move through and then pick up all the secret stuff that's left over. And in some ways, I almost feel like that, in some ways, is almost more like Resident Evil 3-ish than it is like Resident Evil 4. Like I tend to remember the later Resident Evil, especially with Resident Evil 4, being a little bit more fast-paced. And a lot of that, I think, also comes down to the stealth mechanics, right? Is like, if you're crouching down in tall grass and there's a zombie that's walking around, you want to wait for him to turn around so that you can walk up and you can kill him instantaneously. Yeah. So that requires much more patience. Whereas in, say, some of the other Resident Evil games or even Silent Hill games, I mean, I haven't played that many horror games that use stealth as a major component to the game. I mean, some of the Clock Tower stuff maybe, but most of the survival horror games that I end up playing, or that this seems to be kind of paying homage to in certain ways, tend to be there's kind of one way to deal with the enemies on screen: kill them, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to sneak past them. So the game ends up having a slightly slower pace. Another problem that I had with the game is that the camera is just really close to your character.
Yeah, that's kind of... I remember the Resident Evil games kind of being like that as well.
In this case, though, it's...
when they decided to put the camera behind the...
Right. In this case, though, it's like there were a lot of times where I seemed to be having trouble getting around just because orienting the camera in the right direction was a little tedious. But in any case, the game is broken up into a whole bunch of different levels, and it's funny because about half of them, I'd say, are really interesting. The other half are really kind of boilerplate. Like you'll have a crazy boiler room with a bunch of traps and shit in it, right? And you'll have like, oh, here's the ruins of like an old church or a warehouse or something like that, right? Those levels are levels that I've seen in horror games just over and over again. They're very boilerplate. But then there's some levels, especially later on, I don't want to talk about them because they're a little spoilerific, that are really interesting, that are really fascinating as far as either building on the storyline or kind of just telling you what's going on, which is another interesting thing about this game is that the story, the setup to the story, once all that shit that I described at the beginning just goes crazy.
Yeah.
The meat of the story of the game is what is going on here. And by the end of the game, I'd say that I had a good 75% of my questions answered, but there were still a bunch of things that were unanswered.
And any good game should be like that, where maybe there's a few things that are not answered.
Well, it's interesting because as
or story, I should say, not game, but
I was thinking about it, and it's weird because when the game started, I was very interested in the story, but as the game kept going, I felt like my connection to the story kept getting further and further away from the story because the density of story that is fed out to you starts to get, because in between missions, I'm sorry I keep referencing Resident Evil 4 so much, but this feels a lot
parallel.
like Resident Evil 4.
Okay.
But since the through line for the story isn't entirely clear, like the game is very coy about what is reality, what is illusion, what's real, what's not, you know, how you're being affected, why you're being affected, who's affecting you, why they're doing that. That in some cases, over the course of the game, I started to kind of see where the story was going, but I also needed more, right?
Okay.
I needed more than just that one unanswered question, because this is not a really short game. I mean, the game itself is, once again, somewhere in the realm of like a 12 to 14 to maybe 16-hour game, depending on how thorough you are about it. And there's a lot to see in there, and so it's, once again, it's kind of difficult for me to keep me connected emotionally to the idea of what's going on here for that long. There's kind of a question of, I don't know. It's weird. The longer I played the game, the less interested I kind of became in the story, in the mystery of the story, or the more I just kind of wanted to get to the mystery of the story, right?
Okay.
As opposed to the little individual granular things that were happening inside of the different levels. The game also, one of the other things I didn't entirely love about the game is that it does have a few instant kill monsters.
Oh, okay.
Where if they touch you, you're dead. And in some cases, and you can't really damage them very much at all. So you end up just kind of running away from them. Unfortunately, the game isn't super clear a lot of times about that fact. So like the first time that I ran into some of these, because the bosses in the game are very hard. And so there were a couple of different areas where I ran into characters, and it was like I would use just tons of ammo on them because I wasn't sure whether is this just a really difficult boss or is this an invincible creature that'll insta-kill me, because both exist. There are bosses that'll totally insta-kill you in one hit, but you just have to keep pumping ammo into them until they die, right? So in some cases, it felt really cheap a few times, especially this one particular enemy where not only are they invincible, but also if you try to shoot them, they just teleport right up to you and murder you. So
wow, that's kind of weird.
Yeah. In the interim, though, in between you're doing these different missions, you keep going back to this kind of asylum where you've got this crazy ass electric chair that with a colander on it that you put on your head to upgrade yourself. So most of the enemies in the game also drop green goo, which you can trade in to essentially upgrade. And there are, I don't even believe I'm saying this, John, but there are potentially too many upgrades in this game.
Who are you and what have you done with Jeff?
I know. Every individual gun has a series of stats on it with damage, reload, critical hit rate, things like that. And every one of those stats has 5 different tiers of upgrades that have to be bought one at a time. Then you have number of bullets, number of health items, number of this, number of that you can buy. You have a whole bunch of different abilities that your character, or just stats for your character that each have 5 different tiers. You have each individual Agony Bolt type has an upgrade path on it. So you spend a lot of time going between the world and this mental hospital place in order to do this. There's also a really interesting thing where there's like a morgue area in there where there's all these lockers, and over the course of the game you can pick up these keys inside of the level, and each key will unlock a locker, and that locker will either have like some upgrade material or some ammo that you can come back and keep refilling until it's empty. And each individual level also has a few puzzle pieces in it that go into this big map in this one room in the area that are collectible. So there's a lot to do here. There's a lot of in fact, I found myself replaying certain missions just to get upgrade materials to be able to become more powerful. There's a lot to upgrade. There's a lot to do. And if you want to like max the game out, right? Like if you wanted all the upgrades in the game, you're going to play the game like 3 or 4 times. Well, I don't know. You get a pretty big bonus for beating the game for the first time, but you're probably still going to have to be playing the game multiple times. And I don't know how much inherent replay value the game has. Okay. There's also some really odd mechanics in the game. Like you have matches, and the matches... You can use these matches when an enemy falls down on the ground. You can throw a match on them, and it'll burn their bodies, right? So for a while, I was like, well, why am I burning the bodies? Does it mean that if I just leave that they'll get back up again and they'll come back to life? And it seemed like it was more like if you run into 2 enemies that are standing close together, you can hit them with a shotgun blast and then throw a match on them, because if they'll get back up and keep attacking you, or when you knock them down, you use a match to keep them down permanently.
Okay.
So kind of some mechanics like that seemed like they were just a little superfluous, right? Like, okay. I mean, does it really add all that much to the game to have this one mechanic? I mean, when you think about a third-person action or a stealth/survival horror game, does it really add all that much to do that? My answer would probably be no. I don't really think. Like, I stopped using them about 3/4 of the way through the game because it just ended up being a little bit superfluous. Yeah, outside of that, I will say, I feel like I've been dumping on the game for a little while, but I do want to talk about some things that I did really like.
Yeah, what'd you like?
So one of the things that the game does is each time that you find in the game, you find these mirrors that lead you back to the asylum from the individual levels. There's a diary from Seb that basically fills in his backstory, which is fascinating.
Oh, okay.
And it's one of those things where it's kind of tragic and it's interesting and it's moody. But the game never really shoves it in your face all that much. It's not like, it's just some information about him that as you go on, you're just like, oh, God, I feel bad for this guy, right? The villain in the game, I feel like, is really interesting and that they flesh them out in a bunch of really different, interesting ways. There's a bunch of flashback type of stuff. There are a few different enemy types in this game that I feel are really inventive. The ways that you have to go about defeating them are really interesting. And there's some really, some of the levels are boring, but there's some fascinating imagery in the game, especially, I know that it's, I don't know, it was in a lot of the promotional materials, a giant brain with barbed wire wrapped around it. And I wish that they had spent a lot more time going bananas with the idea of what is real and what is not, right? Because it ends up, they did some really interesting stuff, but it kind of feels like they could have gone even further. Like they could have made a truly surreal yet terrifying game because of the framework of the way the game was set up. They definitely have some interesting bosses, some bosses that you have to defeat in some interesting ways. There's some bosses that I didn't think I could defeat, and then when I finally did, it was kind of a little Dark Souls-y, right, where you're like, you've used almost every single bullet you have, and then that boss finally slumps over and goes, and you're just like, oh, God.
And then you're kind of like, I'm kind of badass.
Yep.
Now I got to go refill all my inventory.
Like, very early on in the game, there's a point where I mean, there's no real bones about it. You know, the chainsaw guys in the Resident Evil series?
Yeah.
There's one of those.
Oh, okay.
And he pops out of this place, and you're in this town, and you could just try going to town shooting him, but you realize very early on that a lot of these areas that you've been going through have these traps that you can totally activate, so you try to lure him in and then hit the button. Oh, the spikes come out. He's like, "Bah!" And then you go downstairs and you go, hit the saw blades. Bah! And then you finally kill him, and you're just like, yeah, I am Jigsaw, motherfucker. So there's a lot of really enjoyable parts like that. It's just that the variety of enemies in the game is something that I really hold dear when I play a video game. And this game uses a lot of very similar enemies from beginning to end of the game. They don't do as much to keep introducing new challenges that you have to figure out new ways to get around, as much as just like, oh, well, there was one of those guys last time. Here's two now, bitch. What? You know, which I don't really feel is super effective. It just kind of gets you, you're like, you know.
I'm like, all right, well, now I got to figure out how to do this one thing to both of them in half the time.
Right. So yeah, all in all, I thought it was a decent enough game. I'm going to give it a 3.5.
Okay.
3.5 out of 5. Like, once again, better than average. Worth playing. I don't really know, because of the lack of like replay value, I don't know how much anybody's going to get out of continuing to play it over and over again. And some of the gameplay elements were, like I said, a little bit tedious to the point where I don't know if it would be fun to continue to go back to over and over again. It was one of those games where the actual gameplay mechanics of sneaking or shooting or doing a thing really was fun all intrinsically on its own, to the point where you would just want to go do it over and over and over and over again. So, speaking of which, John, I think that now that we're done with this, I think you and I should go play Resident Evil 4 over and over and over and over again.
I'm down.